So today we're going to review a little bit before you take your quiz. So on the quiz today, it's just sine and cosine graph. So the first days of homework. Next on Monday, we will review all of the graphs. So sine, cosine, and tangent, and cotangent, secant, and cosecant. So if you will take a minute and work through these problems for me. The first one says just determine the amplitude period and phase shift, if there is any, and this one is y equals 3 times cosine of pi over 4x. The second one down here, I want you to graph it. So tell me all the characteristics about it, and then I want you to graph it. It is y equals 30 times sine of x plus pi over 2. And then the next two are the third one here. It says y equals cosine of x plus a 1. And then this fourth one down here says y equals negative 3 times sine of 1/2 x minus a 2. So this is basically on the inside, and then this minus a 2 is on the outside. Same thing up here. This plus a 1 is on the outside. So take a minute and do those four for me. Okay. All right. So this one says determine the amplitude. The amplitude for this one is going to be the absolute value of 3. So the amplitude is going to be 3. The period is going to be, it's a cosine graph, so cosine is always going to be 2 pi. But we're going to divide it by the absolute value of b, right? And in my case, my b is pi over 2. So the absolute value of pi over 2 is not what that is right there. That is a pi over 4. So this is going to be 2 pi divided by the absolute value of pi over 4. So this is going to, if you flip this, this will be, what, 8? So this will be 2 pi times 4 over pi. So the period here will just be an 8. And the phase shift. So is there a phase shift? Remember, phase shift has to have something added or subtracted on the inside right here. So there is no phase shift. So you can just say none for me right there. Okay. All right, so for the second one down here, I want you to graph. So it says y equals 3 sine of x plus a pi over 2. So the same thing is going to happen here. We can find the amplitude, which is going to be a 3. The period is just going to be a 2 pi. But I have a phase shift, and I have a phase shift of shifting left pi over 2. Okay, so my regular period here is going to be from 0 to 2 pi, right? And all the values in between. So 0, pi over 2, pi, and 3 pi over 2, and then back to 2 pi here. But I have a phase shift of an x plus a pi over 2. So that means I am going to shift it, but I'm shifting it to the left pi over 2. So instead of starting out at 0, I'm going to start out at pi over 2, or negative pi over 2, I'm sorry. So it's going to be negative pi over 2, and then I'll go to 0 here, and then I will be back to pi over 2, and then I will be at pi, and then I will end at 3 pi over 2. So this is going to be my new x-axis here with one period. Okay, so with one period, that is going to be your new x-axis. Okay, it's going to have an amplitude of a 3. So your y values are going to stretch by 3. So still at sine of 0, right? Because negative pi over 2 plus pi over 2 gives you a 0. So sine of 0 is going to be a 0. if I plug a 0 in there, this will be sine of pi over 2. So sine of pi over 2 is a 1. 1 times 3 is a 3. Sine of pi over 2 plus pi over 2, which is just going to be a pi. So sine of pi is a 0. If I plug a pi in here, pi plus pi over 2, so that's going to be sine of 3 pi over 2, which is going to be a negative 3, and then I'll go back to a 0. So I'm going to use this little grid here. I took this from MSMS. So I am going to have a negative pi over 2, a 0, a pi over 2, a pi, 3 pi over 2, a 2 pi. Let's not go so close. Let's spread that out a little bit. I'm getting too scrunched in there. So, how about this? Negative pi over 2, a 0, a pi over 2, skip 1, pi here, 3 pi over 2. And I could continue going all the way around. Okay? Alright, so I'm going to go, my y values go from 0 to a 3, and then down to a negative 3. So at negative pi over 2, I'm at a 0, 3, 0, negative 3, and back. So there is one period, and it continues to go in both directions here. So that is one period of your graph there. Good deal. All right, so let's look at these other ones. Also took some paper from MSMS. Had to get all the stuff I needed. I hope I have enough paper to get through. I don't know. Might not. Alright, so if I wanted to graph this, the amplitude here is just a 1. The period is a 2 pi. The phase shift is nothing because there's nothing inside here, so no phase shift. But I am going to have a vertical translation, vertical shift. So this +1 on the outside here means that I am going to shift up 1. So remember, we talked about this the other day, that the midline, remember cosine, is on the x-axis, right? Because it's got x-intercepts right there. So basically the midline, so instead of being right on the x-axis, it's going to move up 1. So then the amplitude is going to go up 1 from there, and then down 1 from there as well. So instead of your y values going in between 1 and -1, it's actually going to go in between 2 and 0. So it's going to be kind of crazy looking. All right, so your period still is going to be a 2 pi. So it's going to go from 0 to 2 pi. So 0 pi over 2 pi, and then 3 pi over 2. So cosine of 0 is 1, but it will be 1 plus a 1, which is a 2. Cosine of pi over 2 is a 0. This will be up 1. Cosine of pi is a Negative 1 plus a 1 is a 0. Cosine of 3 pi over 2 is a 0. And cosine of 2 pi is a 1. So I'm going to be back at a 2 here. Okay, so there is no phase shift. So at x values of a 0 here, so at an x value of a 0, I will be up at a 2. At pi over 2, I will be down at a 1. At pi, I will be at a 0. At 3 pi over 2, I'll be up at 1. And at 2 pi, I'll be back up at 2. So here is one period of your graph. So as long as you know the unit circle, you can do any kind of graphing. Alright, so let's look at this one here. So I've got y equals a negative 3 sine of 1/2 x minus a 2. So this is a 1/2 x on the inside and a minus 2 is on the outside. So the amplitude here is the absolute value of a negative 3. So the amplitude is a 3. The period is going to be a 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b, right? So don't forget the absolute value. So it's going to be 2 pi divided by a 1/2. So your period is going to be 4 pi. So that means your x values are going to go in between 0 for one period to 4 pi. So divide that by 4, so this will be 0, pi, 2 pi, and then 3 pi, and then 4 pi. You can see that. Sorry guys. Okay. Is there a phase shift? No phase shift. No phase shift. What about vertical shift? It's going to move down 2. Right? Alright. So sine of 0, okay, is 0 times negative 3 is 0, 0 minus 2, so this is going to be a negative 2 here. Pi, so sine, when you plug a pi in there, it's actually going to be sine of pi over 2. So sine of pi over 2 is 1. 1 times negative 3 is a negative 3 minus a 2 is a negative 5. Sine of pi is a 0, so this is coming back at a negative 2. Sine of 3 pi over 2 here, so sine of 3 pi over 2 is a negative 1. Negative 1 minus, or times a negative 3 is a positive 3. 3 minus 2 is a 1. And then sine of, when you plug this in there, 4 pi over 2, so that's going to be sine of 2 pi. So sine of 2 pi is going to be back at a negative 2. Okay, so I'm going to take this graph that I drew here and just use these values. So there's your pi, 2 pi. So I'm going to plug these values in here. So here's your x-axis. So here, let's do negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, So at 0, we will be at negative 2. Is that right? At pi, we will be at negative 5. At 2 pi, we will be back up at negative 2. At 3 pi, we will be at 1. And then at 4 pi, we will be back at a 2. So you see how spread out this graph is? How it changes a little bit? The period of it. The one full rotation, one full cycle has spread out. Okay. Alright. Good deal. So that's your graphing for your sine and your cosine. Just make sure that you are working on your tangent, cotangent, cosecant, and secant graphs, because we will work through that next week. We'll talk about a little bit about inverse trig functions, and then we'll have another quiz next Friday. So if you have any questions about anything, let me know. So have a good day.